behind the talk is to argue that common knowledge has been misunderstood, and that this misunderstanding has had a problematic influence on society. So common knowledge, if we're trying to think about what it is, first we just get an intuitive idea of what common knowledge is. Well, it's that which is taken for granted by everyone within a group. So it's taken for granted by each individual, and it's taken for granted in terms of what they think about what other people think. And it's taken for granted in what other people think about what other people think. So some examples. Within the UK, people driving on the left, that would be common knowledge. It's taken for granted by everyone. Within the world, that we are living through a pandemic, although there might be some people who might not be aware of it, most people will be aware of it, and so that's something which is common knowledge. It's something which is taken for granted that everybody knows this. Through history, that rain falls from the sky. And here and now, at any particular instance, you can have common knowledge by just simply doing an action, such as raising a hand and saying, this is a hand, with a gesture. So common knowledge can relate to facts, it can relate to practices, it can relate to norms, and it can relate to values. For example, the value such as torturing an innocent person is wrong is something which we might assume to be common knowledge. So here's another example of common knowledge. This is a particular type of common knowledge, common perceptual knowledge, sometimes known as joint attention. And in situations such as this, for example, you have a teacher showing something to a group of children, pointing out the continent of Africa, for example, then that will become common knowledge amongst that group. And the idea, there'll be background common knowledge as well there, the idea that there is such a thing as the world is common knowledge amongst that group. And common knowledge is something which comes out in our everyday interactions. It's an ineradicable part of our everyday life. An interaction in a shop, for example, depends on common knowledge of the meaning of the language, of something being money, of the value of money, and of the general surroundings. In all of these interactions, these things are taken for granted. The whole idea of money is taken for granted in these interactions. So I'm going to talk about what common knowledge is, how we should model it and understand it. And for that, I'm going to draw on the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And then I'm going to talk about why we need it and what the consequences are if we neglect it. And for that, I'm going to draw on Hannah Arendt. So this is the general outline. In the first part, I'm going to talk about what common knowledge is. And I'm going to contrast two approaches. One approach is the approach which I think is problematic, and that is the constructivist approach to common knowledge. That tries to understand common knowledge in a particular way. And then I'm going to recommend an alternative, which is partially drawn from Ludwig Wittgenstein, which is known as the relational approach to common knowledge. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about the kind of effects of all of this, particularly the kind of effect which a neglect of common knowledge has on our public life. And in particular, if we think about our current epistemic problems, our epistemic crisis, that is the problems which we have in terms of echo chambers and fake news and polarization. And I shall attempt to draw on Hannah Arendt as a way of saying how we could reintroduce common knowledge into the public sphere. Okay, so the first part then is, what is common knowledge? What is the underlying logic that characterizes states of common knowledge? And as I said, there's two general approaches which you could take to this question. On the one hand, you have the constructivist approach, and this is a standard approach within philosophy, psychology, economics, and logic. And on the other, you have a relational approach to common knowledge. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline the constructivist approach first, because that's the standard approach, and I'm going to try and say that there's something wrong with that approach, and then introduce the relational approach as an alternative. Okay, so the constructivist approach to common knowledge, trying to characterize that idea of things being public, things being known and taken for granted amongst a population or amongst a group, takes a fairly natural approach to it. So it says that common knowledge is built out of individual states. So it says that when something is common knowledge, it's common knowledge because each individual in that group knows that thing. And that common knowledge is built on the top of each individual's knowledge. So, for example, if you've got a group who are watching a fireworks display, then on this constructivist approach, common knowledge is a matter of each individual in that group knowing that there's a firework display going on, and each individual within that group knowing that every other individual in that group knows that there's a fireworks display going on, and perhaps that each individual in that group knows that each individual in that group knows that each individual in that group knows that there's a fireworks display going on. And the standard way is to then suggest that perhaps full-blown common knowledge, full-blown publicity, is a matter of those iterations continuing indefinitely, not in a conscious way, but perhaps in a subconscious way. That's the underlying logic of it, that the underlying logic of common knowledge is something which is built upon the knowledge of each individual, and then the knowledge of each individual knowing about the knowledges of each other individual. Okay, so that's the constructivist approach. And just so that you can get a kind of general idea of how this works, here's a situation which we just think of two people rather than having a group for a moment. So you can think of two people within a restaurant, and perhaps what happens is that the waiter comes along and brings them a bottle of wine. Well, the constructivist approach says that common knowledge of that bottle of wine being there in front of them is a matter of, firstly, one person, the person on the left, knowing that the bottle of wine is there, and then the person on the right, knowing that the bottle of wine is there, and then the person on the left, knowing that the person on the right knows that there's a bottle of wine there, and then the person on the right, because obviously they know that the person on the left knows that there's a bottle of wine there, and so on. Okay, so the idea here, as you can see, is it's built upon underlying states. That's the idea of common knowledge. That's taken as standard. That's taken as standard within economics, within political thought, and within psychology. And it regards each individual as ultimately boxed off within their own mind, within their own world. And that then they only generate knowledge about each other through some kind of back and forth transaction of information. So they only recognize what someone else knows by getting some information from the other person, perhaps just a look, but still some kind of information from the other person that they're aware of that fact. And that, as I say, is a kind of standard approach. But I also think that it's a problematic approach, and I'll just try and quickly explain why I think it's a problematic approach. And there's three difficulties which I think arise from this constructivist approach, this idea that mutual knowledge and common knowledge is built upon individuals' knowledge. The first is a logical problem, and this problem is a problem in which when we have common knowledge, it seems that what happens is we have shared knowledge. But if the constructivist approach is right, we don't ever seem to have shared knowledge. Rather, we just have a back and forth of transactional knowledge, which never gets genuinely shared. We never get genuine parity of knowledge between the two of us. Okay, so that's, or between the group. That's the first problem. It's a logical problem. It can be brought out in many different ways, but I just bring it out in that way. The second problem is a psychological problem. And I think it's not always noted how complex common knowledge can get once you start making a group bigger. So if you've just got two people, you can kind of see how it works. I know what you know what I know that you know what I know. Okay, you can kind of see how that works and how that might build up. But actually, if you start introducing new agents into the scene, such as you've got a group of 3 or then a group of 4, the complexity grows exponentially. Because now I don't just need to keep track of what you know about me. I also need to keep track of the third person and what they know about me, but also what the third person knows about you, and what the third person knows about what you know and what I know about. Okay, that's hard enough with just 3 people. Now I think there's 4, there's 5. It grows exponentially in terms of its complexity. So that's the second problem, psychological problem. And then we should just remember that actually common knowledge, at least in its kind of guise of joint attention, appears to be something which is achievable by young children. In fact, joint attention appears to begin around about the age of 9 months. And the work of Michael Tomasello, a developmental psychologist, shows that children are perfectly adept at knowing what knowledge is shared within a group, knowing what background knowledge is shared within a group. And yet they might find it more difficult to work out what any single individual knows or doesn't know. Rather, they seem to be much better equipped at understanding what a whole group knows. And that suggests that common knowledge is not quite this constructivist thing. It looks as if it's not built in this way in which the constructivist suggests. So that's a summary of this kind of constructivist approach and what's wrong with this constructivist approach. The idea that common knowledge is constructed out of the knowledge of individuals is, I would argue, both theoretically and empirically inadequate. So how should we understand it? So I'm going to suggest that there's another approach. I call it the relational approach. And I'm going to use the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein to kind of elucidate how this approach to common knowledge should work. So Ludwig Wittgenstein is an Austrian-born philosopher. He lived in Cambridge, and he was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. And his book On Certainty, which is where he talks about related ideas to common knowledge, is a series of reflections on knowledge and skepticism that were found as notes on his death. It was kind of, a lot of them were kind of cut up and put into jars and things like that. I think the last entry was written maybe 2 days before he died. So the approach that Wittgenstein sketches in his book On Certainty has come to be known as Hinge Epistemology. So epistemology is a theory of knowledge, and perhaps you'll see in a little while why it's called Hinge Epistemology. But the way to understand this approach is that it effectively flips the standard approach on its head. So whereas the standard approach, the constructivist approach, is a matter of common knowledge being built out of individual states of knowledge, on this view, common knowledge is what underpins individual states of knowledge, that you only get individual states of knowledge because there is an underlying infrastructure of common knowledge. So what we commonly know, according to this approach, is what underpins and grounds what we each know as individuals. So common knowledge is a set of presuppositions, and certainly a set and a kind of group of presuppositions that are required in order for us to act and interact in any meaningful way, that they lay the groundwork for us being able to have any individual states of knowledge and any individual beliefs and have any individual ideas. So just to be clear, Wittgenstein never uses the term common knowledge himself, and there'll be some who would dispute that he's talking about this phenomena, but I think he is talking about this phenomena. He calls it certainties. He calls these things certainties. And certainties belong to a different logical category from individual mental states. They're a completely different category from what we know or believe or doubt. They're a different logical category because they're much more fundamental, according to Wittgenstein. They form, as he puts it, the substratum of all our inquiring and asserting. So I'll try and elucidate this by using some of the metaphors which he uses. He has a range of different, quite striking metaphors which he uses to try and explain what he means by certainties. And by certainties, I think he means something akin to common knowledge. So the three metaphors which I want to bring out are the road metaphor, the scaffolding metaphor, and the riverbed metaphor. So the road metaphor is this. So I'll just read out the quote first from Wittgenstein's On Certainty. He says, "It may be, for example, that all inquiry on our part is set so as to exempt certain propositions, that is, certain ideas, certain items of knowledge, from doubt. They're exempt from doubt, if they are ever formulated at all. They lie apart from the route travelled by inquiry. That is, they lie apart from the route travelled by inquiry, the route travelled by doubt, the route travelled by argument. That is to say, things which are common knowledge are a bit like the traffic islands, or the road markings, or the barriers, or the traffic lights that form the underlying structure that allows for a road transport system. Without that underlying structure, you simply couldn't have a functioning road transport system. And any decisions which you make about your journey home are made within the confines of that structure. That is to say, if you come across a red light, then you simply stop. It's not like you've got a choice. It's not like you're even going to consider not going, just going through the red light. There it is, it's a red light, you stop. And the same goes for a traffic island, like in the middle of a roundabout. You're not going to sort of consider just driving over the middle of it. Rather, it's something which is set aside, where all of your decisions are made within that structure. So that's the road metaphor. The road metaphor says that what is common knowledge is that kind of infrastructure upon which the rest of us can do all of our different actions, and that we can take for granted that everybody else is going to do their actions within that infrastructure as well. Okay, so that's one metaphor. The second metaphor is the scaffolding metaphor. So here's a quote from Wittgenstein. It's one of my favourite quotes from Wittgenstein, actually. It's this, that much seems to be fixed. Perhaps it was once disputed, but perhaps for unthinkable ages it has belonged to the scaffolding of our thoughts. So this is the idea that common knowledge is like the framework or scaffold that gives structure to our form of life. That there are these perhaps kind of ancient assumptions which we have and which are just part of our way of being, part of our way of living. The idea that someone just doesn't suddenly disappear into thin air, that would be just part of our assumptions. It would be part of our structure of our thoughts and our assumptions. And notice it's not just part of the assumption which I make, it's part of the assumption which we make. It's part of the assumption that I assume that you're not going to think for a minute that things suddenly disappear, or you're not going to think for a minute that time will suddenly speed up and jump 10 years ahead. These are shared knowledge which we share. And then finally, there's another metaphor, the riverbed metaphor. And according to this metaphor, common knowledge is a bit like the riverbed, or like the riverbanks, along which the river can flow. So all of our arguments, all of our inquiries, all of our ideas flow along a bedrock of common knowledge, an underlying bedrock of common knowledge. And he uses this metaphor to say that sometimes things which are not common knowledge might become common knowledge because they might be parts of the river which then settle into the sediment. Or alternatively, something which was common knowledge might pop up from the riverbed and then become part of the flowing river. So an example of that would be the existence of God and belief in the existence of God. That used to be part of our common knowledge. That used to be part of the riverbed. It used to be an assumption which everybody just took for granted. If you go back to the early modern period or the medieval period, it was just something which was structuring the whole of life. Whereas now, that belief that God exists is no longer something which is common knowledge. Rather, it's a choice. It's something which we can't assume that other people have. So that's the idea, anyway, of kind of this Wittgensteinian approach. This Wittgensteinian approach flips the constructivist approach on its head. And it says, rather than thinking of common knowledge as something which is built out of the individual states of different individuals within society or within a group, it says, well, actually what common knowledge is it's what underlies our life. It's what makes our life possible. It's what makes our arguments and our assertions and our beliefs and our ideas possible. It's only because we've got these underlying assumptions, an underlying assumption that objects don't suddenly disappear, or an underlying assumption that it's considered wrong to harm an innocent being. All of these different things which form the substructure of our life. So just, oops, that's gone, sorry, there we go. Just to summarize that then, there's two things which it's worth keeping in mind here about what I'm claiming common knowledge is. That firstly, it has a particular kind of logical role. It has a fundamentally different logical role in our lives to those things which we know, believe, doubt or dispute. Rather, it's something which is much more basic than that. It's the presupposed framework for those things. And it's something which is not properly doubted. It's not neither true nor false. It is, as he says at one point, above and beyond justification and truth. And secondly, against the kind of psychological point of view, is it's interpersonal. These are not features of individual cognitive psychology, but a part of the grammar or the structure of our shared lives. Okay, so I hope that kind of makes sense. The claim is that there's an approach to common knowledge which has been in the ascendancy for perhaps the last 50 years within economics, psychology, political thought, philosophy, epistemic logic. And it's the idea that common knowledge, that is, those things which we know together, are built out of states of individual knowledge. And I've suggested that that is a problematic way of approaching common knowledge, and rather we should think of it as flipped on its head, and rather we should think of common knowledge as being something which underpins our individual knowledge, that it's the substratum, it's the framework of our capacity to understand and interact with each other. Okay, so now I'm just going to try and talk about why we need common knowledge. And in particular, I'm going to try and draw out, maybe in a slightly roundabout way, but I'm going to try and draw out why this constructivist construal of common knowledge and the way it's been taken on board by economists and politicians, etc., has actually had a deleterious effect on our culture and on our society. Okay, so let's just think for a moment what would happen if we had a complete loss of common knowledge. Now, this isn't likely to happen. Okay, even in our worst case scenario, we're not going to have a complete loss of common knowledge. But suppose we did have a complete loss of common knowledge. What would happen? Well, let's go to the metaphors. What would happen if we lost the scaffolding of our lives? Well, then our lives and our cultures would start to crumble. We would no longer be able to properly interact with each other at all. Or to take the other analogy of the roads, you take away those road markings, you take away the assumptions of which side you drive on, the assumptions which go into the traffic lights and all the different aspects of the kind of driving code, and you've got complete chaos. You no longer have a properly working transport system. Or to take one more example, the riverbed. What happens if that structure goes, if the riverbed and the riverbanks go? Well, then the water just goes everywhere. You no longer have the structure, you no longer have the flowing river. That's why you need common knowledge, because our whole way of life, our form of life, the whirl of our form of life, as Wittgenstein puts it, is dependent upon that underlying structure. It's dependent on that common knowledge. But common knowledge comes in many different varieties. It's kind of layered. And one way to think about this idea that common knowledge is kind of layered. So there are things which are further down and things which are a bit further towards the top. All of them are common knowledge, but they're kind of, some things are further down, some things a bit higher up. So think about a game of football, for example. Okay, so what would be required in order to play a game of football? Well, there are certain things which are required for just the basic elements of the game that the individuals know, and they all know that they know what a ball is, and that they all know that they know what a hand is, and that handball is not allowed, for example. That's kind of seems as if it's pretty essential to a game of football, as is the concept of a goal and of scoring a goal. Okay, so those are the very basic elements which are required for a game of football. If you've not got those things, then you haven't got a game of football at all. But then built on top of that, there are other things which are pretty much common knowledge amongst, for example, professional footballers, and that is the offside rule. Although not everybody watching might know what the offside rule is, everyone who's playing it has to know what the offside rule is. And these kinds of rules, the kinds of rules which turn up in a football game, are common knowledge, but they're also things which are perhaps a bit more adaptable. And they're also things which are susceptible to erosion. They're things which, if people are not really taking care of them, they can actually go in the wrong direction. Anyone who's a football fan might know of VAR as being one of these things where you might think that's one of the kind of areas where football's gone wrong in terms of what it's got. But the idea here is that any of these particular rules can be better or worse. And they're better or worse just insofar as they help the game. They help the game flourish. So in order to have a good game, we don't just need common knowledge of the basic elements and rules. We also need to develop good rules that are conducive to a good game, that help generate a good game. So the point here is that common knowledge is something which can be eroded. Okay, so in what ways might it be eroded? Well, we can think about our current situation, our current challenges. We think about the digital revolution, for example, and how we're living through a significant epistemic change, epistemic meaning knowledge. So our lives are moving more and more online, and the expectations that govern conduct, both moral conduct as well as epistemic conduct, seem to be changing. So the infrastructure that comprises our common knowledge seems to be different as we're moving online. And it seems to be coming under some kind of strain as well. It seems to be eroding to a certain degree. So we think about things such as filter bubbles, echo chambers, fake news, conspiracy theories, polarization. Now, no doubt these things have been exaggerated, but they're also there, and we can see the effects of, for example, polarization in many countries, particularly the US and the UK. So let's think about that and about, in some way, the way in which there's a lack of common knowledge here and there's an erosion of common knowledge and how it might have turned up. So when we think, for example, of filter bubbles, well, what's a filter bubble? Well, Nguyen characterizes it as this. He calls it a social epistemic structure in which other relevant voices, that is, voices other than one's own or people who one agrees with, have been left out, perhaps accidentally. So these are sometimes generated by algorithm. So sometimes you have these algorithms like on YouTube, which will then just give you the next video on the assumption that if you liked that, then you'll like this. And sometimes they're self-generated, like, for example, with Twitter, where you choose who you want to follow, and then you get the information from those people who you've chosen to follow. What seems to be happening with filter bubbles is instead of having some kind of shared understanding, we are, as Pariser puts it, being offered parallel but separate universes. We're all living in our in our kind of separate universes. And this gives rise to something which is called echo chambers. And echo chambers can be distinguished from filter bubbles because they're social epistemic structures from which other relevant voices are not just ignored, but they're actively excluded and discredited. So echo chambers differ from filter bubbles to the extent that other viewpoints might be allowed in, but when they are allowed in, they are actively distorted or undermined. And so echo chambers are more opinionated than filter bubbles. They're not just matters of ignoring other voices. They're matters of actually creating divisions between people. They actively promote some ideas and denigrate others. As Nguyen puts it, echo chambers may theoretically be escapable, but he claims we have little reason to expect members of echo chambers to realise that they are members of something that actually needs escaping. They won't realise that because they're stuck within that epistemic bubble, that echo chamber. And within those filter bubbles, and within those echo chambers, they're ripe for manipulation. They're ripe for manipulation by companies which are seeking to get clicks and to get revenue, but also by political actors seeking influence or disruption. And so this all leads to some kind of sense of polarisation. Polarisation is a condition where political officials and ordinary citizens are so deeply divided that there's no basis for compromise or even productive communication among them. There is, within a polarised society, a tendency to regard those with whom we disagree as increasingly inscrutable, irrational, ignorant, and unreliable, say Aikins and Talese. So this seems to be the opposite of common knowledge. It seems to be something which is generated by this kind of hyper-individualism, the same kind of aptitude, that kind of hyper-individualism, which underpins that constructivist model of common knowledge. So you end up getting this kind of reinforcement, this reinforcement of individual filter bubbles, which are then being evolved into echo chambers, which are then filled with fake news and propaganda, which then leads to polarization and then even more divorced filter bubbles. Okay, so how should we think about this and what potentially could be done? I want to draw on Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt effectively argues that this hyper-individualistic model is something which neglects an idea which can be traced all the way back actually to ancient Greece. The idea of life and our public life as being more like a forum than like a market. And I'll try and explain what that idea is. I don't have any neat answers, by the way, as to how this is going to apply to the online world, but I wonder whether, you know, some people might have some ideas about how some of Hannah Arendt's ideas might apply there. So this is Hannah Arendt. She's one of the most influential political thinkers of the 20th century. She was born in 1906 in Germany. She was Jewish. She was arrested in 1933 along with her mother, and she was held for 7 days, I think, in prison. And then after that, she recognized what was happening in the country and she fled Germany. She went to Paris for a while and ended up in the United States, I think sometime in the later 1940s. Her writings have various different dimensions, but they revolve around civic duty and what is required to avoid a repeat of the totalitarian regimes. She was particularly thinking of the Nazi regime, but also was talking about Stalin as well, which arose in the first half of the 20th century. So there's just a list of some of her key works if you're interested, particularly the origins of totalitarianism. I think it's got quite a lot to say about our world today. Okay, so Arendt's concern was to suggest that there's a way of thinking about society, which is quite similar to the way which Wittgenstein was thinking about society, which would avoid the twin perils of, on the one hand, an atomized mass market society, in which people become very, very individualistic and perhaps quite greedy, and on the other hand, a totalitarian regime in which all individuality is effectively squeezed out. And she saw there was a relation between these two, actually. She thought that one led to the other, which is why I think she's so important to think about in now. So she says, we have here twins, each wearing a different hat. And she says, what makes mass society, that is mass society in terms of kind of commercial society, so difficult to bear is not the number of people involved, but the fact that the world between them, and this is the kind of concept she wants to get to, something which is similar to what Wittgenstein was talking about, this world between us, these kind of assumptions between them, has lost its power to gather us together and to relate and separate each other. So Arendt argues that within a divided, atomized and confused society, mass propaganda and proto-totalitarian movements move into the spaces that mass society leaves vacant. So here's a quote where she says, in an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses have reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and nothing was true. Now, this might seem contradictory at first, as she says that people have a mixture of gullibility and cynicism. But actually, I think it's quite astute what she's saying here. What she's saying is that in a world where people don't really know what's true or false, where people are confused about what's true or false, they become cynical about what's true or false. So the only thing they've got to rely on are their own desires, what they want to be true. And so at one and the same time, they're cynical, but they're also gullible, because the only thing they've got to rely on are things which they want to be true. So they're gullible and ready for propaganda. So that's the kind of link which Hannah Arendt sees between an atomized society and something even darker, some kind of totalitarian situation. But she also thinks there's ways in which we can think about our society which can avoid that. And it's that common world which she thinks we need to kind of nourish and which we need to develop. And she thinks about it in strikingly similar ways, I think, to Wittgenstein. I mean, she's thinking more on a political level, while Wittgenstein's thinking more on a kind of epistemic level. But they're thinking in the same kind of way here, I think. So she says that the public world as a common world, a world in which we're thought of as equals, where the knowledge is between us rather than something which is atomized. So that public world as a common world gathers us together. It prevents us from falling over each other, so to speak. And this is where I think she's strikingly similar to Wittgenstein, is that this public sphere which she talks about, this public realm, has two parts. There's the underlying part, B there, which is the common world, which is a shared and public set of institutions, norms and infrastructure, which provides a relatively permanent and durable context for activities. And then on top of that, she has what she calls the space of appearances. But the space of appearances is where you can become and come out as an individual. It's a space of individual freedom and equality, which comes into being whenever citizens act in concert through the medium of speech and persuasion. So the idea here is that this kind of common knowledge, which is going to be there anyway, but can be neglected and can be eroded, can also be built up again if we really take some care of this common world and these underlying infrastructures. And particularly if you go back to the kind of analogy of the football game, it's kind of making sure that our public world is one which allows the people within it to flourish in the same way that you want the rules of a football game to allow the game to flourish, to allow the things to work well. So this is a kind of common world, which she calls the common world, which I've been calling something like common knowledge, which Wittgenstein calls certainties. the common world provides an infrastructure and culture within which individuality can flourish. And if you want to make that common world as good as possible, because we're not going to lose it, again, to point this out, we're not going to lose it completely. It's there. I mean, there's no way in which we're going to lose completely our common knowledge, but we can nurture it or not nurture it. And the common world, this kind of nurtured common knowledge, which would then allow for this kind of flowering of individuality and this flourishing of individuals, should be, and this is the way in which Hannah Arendt and then after her Jürgen Habermas are thinking about it. So it should be maximally inclusive. So obviously it shouldn't just be for any particular group, not just for white men. So you think about something like Twitter, where it's often said that, that the kind of abuse which women get is quite different, and particularly online. It's the kind of abuse which women get is quite different from the kind of abuse online which men get. And so you'd want to make sure that there was some kind of infrastructure, some kind of norms which were in place, which were for the good of everybody and maximally inclusive. And also, you'd want to make sure, and this is something she thought was really important, and Jürgen Habermas after her thought was really important, is that this common world, this common infrastructure, must be something which is independent from both the market and from state interests. It must be one in which individuals can come and individuals can create it for themselves. Individuals meaning us as a community, but it's something in between us as a community. It's not something which is top down from the state, and it's not something bottom up from the market. And the final point which I want to mention, sorry, I'm going on a bit, so I should probably stop. But the common world provides also a space. She thought this was really important, actually, that she also thought there needed to be a space for retreat. And anyone who's kind of heard of Hannah Arendt might have heard about what she said about she went the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust. And one of the things which she thought there was, she thought, well, actually, evil is caused by the most ordinary people. And so what you need also is you need people to have the capacity to be able to step back from society, to step back, for example, from whatever jobs they're doing, and just give them the space to be able to kind of reflect on what society they're living in. That's really important for building a common world, so that the common world doesn't turn sour. Okay, so this kind of, I've gone on a little bit of meander there, but I hope the kind of general argument is clear. But this is a summary then. Is that common knowledge is standardly seen as constructivist, that is, it's standardly seen as individuals, each having what they individually know, and then common knowledge is built on top of that. I suggested that that model is problematic and we should re-envisage common knowledge along the relationalist lines suggested by Wittgenstein, where common knowledge is something which is the basic infrastructure of our shared lives. I argued that the constructivist model, the model which I argued against, is implicit in standard political, economic and psychological thought, and because it misunderstands it, it can lead to an erosion of that common knowledge, where common infrastructure, where we're not allowing it to be nourished in the way which it perhaps should be nourished. And this is partially evident with current divisions with things such as echo chambers and the like. And that Hannah Arendt's model, I'm not quite sure how, but I think that there is a model there from Hannah Arendt which shows how we might be able to think about how a common world based around common knowledge could be developed that would allow for individuals to flourish. So I've gone on a bit longer than I should have, but I will stop there, and I think there'll be questions now.
Mike?
Yeah.
Before you start, can you switch your light on? It's getting darker.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.